Oh, sorry.
No, it's all good. Hi, everybody. I'm Jenna Blum. Welcome to Mighty Blaze. I am one of the co-founders of The Blaze, along with the best-selling novelist Caroline Levitt and 35 creative professional volunteers dedicated to connecting writers and readers in the age of COVID and now well beyond. We are bringing you your favorite authors in your living room where you can see them answering all the questions you ever wanted to know without even having to put on pants. And today, I am here with one of my dear friends, Luis Alberto Urrea. Welcome, Luis. We are so happy to have you here.
Jenna, I'm so happy to be with you.
Hello, and Luis's wife, Cindy, is sitting off to the side, we know, so maybe I'll convince her to just a hand. She's very shy, but we're so happy to have like both of you. Maybe we can lure her out of the foxhole a little bit later. So for those of you who are new to The Blaze, welcome. As I said, we're a team of 35 creative professional volunteers. If you like what you see here, please give us a like or a follow on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube. We are ubiquitous. Please consider signing up for our newsletter at www.mightyblaze.com so you never have literary FOMO ever again. No mo FOMO. Nobody likes that. And if you are a Blaze repeat offender, welcome back. Thank you for bringing your light to the Blaze. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce today's guest, although many of you I know already know him. Luis, you ready for your official bio?
Okay. Oh, no. All right. I'm ready.
Okay. Buckle up. I'm going to read it off your jacket, so it won't be too
okay.
Finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for his landmark work of nonfiction, The Devil's Highway, now in its 34th printing. What even is that? Luis is the author of numerous other works of nonfiction, poetry, and fiction, 19 books, y'all, including the national bestsellers The Hummingbird's Daughter and The House of Broken Angels, which was a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist. He is a recipient of the American Academy Arts and Letters Award, among many other honors, and lives outside Chicago and teaches at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And also he is wait, what did I want to say about this? Oh, yes. Importantly, and not included in the jacket of your beautiful new book, NPR called you a literary badass, which I think is one of my favorite descriptions of an author ever.
I paid them a bribe for that.
I'm gonna start with that. Okay, yes, because I would bribe NPR to call me a literary badass, and they'd still be like, I don't know. Do you agree with this description? Are you a literary badass?
No, I'm a grandpa. I've got 2 little tiny dogs. I don't know. I'd define it. You know, I was amazed when that came out. I was embarrassed. But you know, that part of me from Southern California with all my rock guitar playing pals, I thought, yeah, why not? Why can't I be one too? You know?
I think you are. And I think the fact that you're a grandpa and also have little dogs does not in any way disqualify you from being a literary badass or a badass in general. So today we are here to talk about Lisa's new novel, Goodnight Irene. And some of you may have seen me post about this on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. And I was so excited to read the book and talk about the book. And then once I started to really immerse in reading it, which I did like on my window seat, like a teenager, and just read and read and read in a sort of a fever dream of reading, which is both very rare and my favorite way to read. Then I was reading until 4 a.m. I have to say that this is one of the best books I have ever read, period. Like, hands down. This is now one of my top 10 favorite books of all time. And it's one of the best books I've ever read about the greatest generation. And as a World War II author, I get all the books, you know, and there are so many people writing amazing books, and nothing should ever be forgotten about that time. But I have such love for this book, and I will explain why. But Luis, will you please introduce Goodnight Irene to us in your own words first?
Okay. So my mother was named Phyllis, and she was the only American in my family. I was born in Mexico. And she was strange. Just for that, she was strange. But she was a New Yorker. I'd never been to New York, of course, and I never thought I would get there. And so she's, she joined the Clubmobile Corps at the Red Cross in 1943. And these were women who women, what's the word? Ran clubs for the Red Cross, and the clubs were for non-coms or officers. They had different ones. And Eisenhower was one of the people who thought, what if we made this mobile? What if we put the club on the back of a truck and sent these women into the field? I don't think he was thinking send them into combat. In fact, some people have already argued with me that they never saw combat. And I thought, boy, I have the receipts and the pictures right here, my friend. Those were all men, by the way, mansplainers. And um, so they went. And my mother met up with a woman named Jill Pitts. My mom, of course, from New York, kind of a socialite. She thought she was a 40s movie star, very stylish. And Jill was a Hoosier, farm gal, sophisticated on some levels, but she knew how to drive a tractor and a truck. And Jill wanted to be on the front lines. And the best thing she could do was drive the truck. My mother was escaping a terrible first marriage. And so these women had to be 27. They had to have some education, some college, and they had to be trained. So they all went to Washington, D.C., trained to, of course, make donuts, but to also drive the giant truck, to fire a gun, to wear a gas mask, to learn how to be home, a rolling home for these young men. And the Corps was named the Club Mobile because the truck was the mobile, the club on it. In the back of this 2.5-ton GMC truck was a galley. There were serving counters, and they had doors that lifted so that they could serve out the sides of the truck. There were 2 big coffee makers, tanks for water. There was an electric donut machine that would plop out dozens and dozens of raw donuts into a grease cooker, and the women would deliver donuts and coffee. If the soldiers didn't have a canteen with a tin cup, they would provide a cup. And to me, the coolest part, in the back, way in the back of the truck, each truck had a record player on a swivel that would pivot down. And then the gals, aside from cooking and flirting and being everybody's big sister or girlfriend, whatever their job was, they played the hits. They were DJs. And the trucks had speakers, loudspeakers, so the women would play, Frank Sinatra or Glenn Miller or whatever was the hit of the day, whatever the Red Cross could provide for them in records. And they ended up going into combat. They landed on Utah Beach. There's pictures of the trucks driving on Utah Beach. In fact, somebody wrote me and said, there's a picture of these women, and the one in front looks like your mom. And I thought, it's possible. She was everywhere. They liberated towns. They took part in the liberation of Paris. They took part in the liberation of Brussels. They were trapped in the siege of Bastogne. They were caught in the Battle of the Bulge when the Germans broke through. They drove all the way through Germany and liberated Buchenwald. So it was an extraordinary experience for these young women, and they've been forgotten. They've been completely erased. So I was telling Jenna before we started, it's taken, I think, my entire life as a writer to feel that I was worthy of telling their story. That's a nutshell.
Thank you. That it's a comprehensive nutshell, but it all needs to be said, and it spawns so many questions for me and so many thoughts. Jenna, capital T thoughts. One of them is that when we think about women going in these trucks, like the big trucks, and not like trucks like you get in now and it's like a GMC and it's an automatic shift, like, and you're driving in these terrible conditions with a stick shift with people shelling you and so on. But you think, okay, they were the donut dollies. And one of the first scenes in the book is a woman who is their commander saying, don't ever let anybody call you a donut dolly. Like, you are here in service. And so the whole book, the women, the guys are saying like, hey, dollies. And they're like, don't call us dolly. which is so great. But they weren't just dollies. Like, it sounds like a
No.
soft job to go, okay, all you have to do is make these donuts, which is more difficult than it sounds under these conditions, and then, serve that and coffee through a window. And it wasn't like that at all. And some of what you just talked about, when I was reading this book, it reminded me so much of Band of Brothers, or rather Band of Sisters, I guess, in this case, because of the track that the women's truck took. They didn't know. They thought they were just going over to serve the donuts and the coffee, and then they literally followed the same track as in Band of Brothers, like from landing at D-Day all the way up to the liberation of Buchenwald, and then finally going up into Berchtesgaden, where Hitler's bunker was. So they really had a front row seat. And one of the things that struck me so greatly reading this, as a creature of screens and as of our modern era, where we are have all the mod cons and are so acclimated to that, the physicality of these women's lives was so incredible and so pressing. And you did an incredible job also, I might say, writing convincingly from the female perspective of what it's like to inhabit a soft female body and then go through these conditions. Can you talk about recreating that physicality for your modern reader of what your mom and her friends went through?
Yeah, it starts a long time ago, but I was raised by women. My family was all women with a couple of crowing, bellowing macho men. And I would watch all of the women that I revered and worshiped more than the men, watch them. And the guys would bellow through and proclaim whatever manly wisdom and go outside to pick whatever they were growing for supper. And the women waited for those guys to wear themselves out, and then they got back to running the world. And so my entire worldview was, from tias, ninas, cousins, half sisters, people in the neighborhood, and my mom. And my mother provided the intellectual stuff. My mom was a super literate woman from New York, and they ran an antique store in Manhattan, and one of their clients was Einstein. Her uncle would go drink beer with Al until I realized, Al Einstein, what? And my mom wanted me to be somebody other than the impoverished Southern San Diego kid. And she fed me Dickens, and she fed me Mark Twain, and she fed me the Jungle Books, and she tried to get me to read Mishner, but the books were too long. Mm-hmm. But one of the things she foisted on me early was Ernest Hemingway, and that may have been one of my first sort of writer celebrities, because I was more fascinated in his mad life than his writing, because I just wasn't ready to process it. And you need to know that the last touch about this, I think, is that my discoverer, my guru and main teacher in writing was Ursula K. Le Guin. And she took me under her wing when I was 21 or so. And wow, she was wonderful, kind, generous, and rather terrifying. She didn't take foolishness lightly, and she didn't take male BS lightly either. And it was she who told me one day, she used to call me Luisito. She said, Luisito, it's time for you to become a feminist. And I thought, what's that, man? I was 21. What do I do? And she said, well, for the rest of your college time, you're going to take women's literature classes. And I said, okay, and Doris Lessing, here came Olive Schreiner and these amazing writers. And Le Guin also, just to let you know how formidable she was, she took me into her writing workshop. She published my first story in an anthology to get me going. But then she brought Toni Morrison into our workshop. You imagine in the 70s in La Jolla, Toni Morrison, and the writers, they didn't even know. Yeah, Toni Morrison. She wasn't yet the Toni goddess, but she was always a goddess, And she came in, and they were besties. And Ursula said, well, talk to Ms. Morrison, and people would ask her these fatuous questions. And this is what Toni Morrison would do. She'd do this. She never said a word to anybody. And we all shrank. Yeah, So I've just always my best friends are all women. What can I tell you? And I feel blessed by that. But you're also honoring your mother, and you're also honoring what you don't know about your mother, because I didn't know so much about her. I knew her nightmares. She sank deeper and deeper into PTSD as life went on, and it was terrible. She lost herself, I think, in so many ways. She was miserable and consumed by fright, and I became an insomniac because there was no sleeping in my house. So when I was a kid in high school, I've said this a few times, but nighttime, my mom having horrible dreams, and me in my bedroom with Leonard Cohen. Leonard Cohen, and wishing I could do that. Whatever he was doing, I wanted to do Leonard Cohen's work. And when I saw that he was a novelist and a poet too, I got a notebook and I started writing. And the only people I would dare show it to were my gals in high school. So it's always, I think, been, whether I knew it or not, not necessarily the dude path with car chases and gunfights. So that's the kind of movies I loved, but I was something else was going on inside. It may have been my mom's soul telling me, write about me someday.
Yeah, I want to ask about that as well, and I'll try to do that without tearing up too much and blubbering everywhere. But first, I want to tip my hat to the fact that there is such a rare mix in this book, I think, of feminism and the understanding of the way women actually talk to each other, which now makes sense to me based on what you just said. The women are very sassy in this book, and their repartee is very sort of like Butch Cassidy, Sundance Kid, Thelma and Louise-ish, but it rings completely true to me. And although there is romance in this book, and in the trenches, in the forest, like in the skies, and also there is sex in this book, and the real love story, I think, is between the women who are driving the truck. And so there's that. And then there's also this very, like, there's a Hemingway-esque imprint on this, not in the writing, which is very lush and descriptive to the point. Like, I actually wrote in the margins at one point, like, oh, come on, because the description was so beautiful. Like, my writer envy got triggered, and that's my highest compliment. But so the writing is much lusher than Papa Hemingway's, but there also is a non-shying away from the horror of combat. And some moments in this book that I will never forget. And at first I'm just like, oh, this is a book about the donut dollies, and it's going to be female friendship, and it's beautifully written. Like, that's great, whatever. And then there are these moments that just startle you the way they would startle you in combat, because they come upon you suddenly and you just think, oh, holy F, and I want to read one of those too, if you don't mind. But I feel like it's such a rare and beautiful combination of what we traditionally think of as like the masculine and the feminine in writing. So it's on page 41 in case you're following along at home with your copy. And by the way, if you don't have a copy of Goodnight Irene yet, you should buy at least 50 copies. Like, right now, in the chat. So the women are crossing. They haven't even gotten to England yet, and they're donut truck, and they're on a ship going overseas, and they're drinking on the ship in a fake smokestack that actually houses other stuff, with this guy named Willie, as one does, drinking your whiskey with Willie, and all of a sudden they see this like little flame or a little orange flickering thing, and they're like, what even is that? And they don't know. Flames, a sickly orange and red and green, doubled and shattered on the black oiled water. The ship ahead of theirs had been hit by a torpedo. It had ruptured, breaking in half, both ends tipping at sharp angles as the center sagged into the waves. The munitions aboard it caught fire and went off like fireworks, streaking through the air, trailing sparks and exploding, and sending myriad smaller comets into the sea. Its bow was sliding backward into the ocean, and sailors leaped from it only to disappear as it sucked them down. The ship looked at once small and vast. Underwater, it blew again, and the light was horrid green as the sea boiled up and turned white. And that is actually the beginning of the shipwreck scene. And that's like, welcome to war, right, ladies? Like, this is, the sort of introduction, and it's not an anomalous scene. So one of the things I want to ask you, as somebody who often writes in this era and kind of has to like, spit on my hands and write these scenes of destruction, were these hard for you to write? I'll start there.
What was hard was to try to not be a faker. And just recently, because I'm doing all these interviews, and it's a lot of stuff that's been so internal that suddenly you're putting it out in the air, and you can almost watch it fly away and think, oh, what an interesting little bird, But I realized that I was thinking about Stephen Crane, of all people, when he wrote Red Badge of Courage, he'd never seen combat. And he was afraid that he would be caught out as a fake. And when it was published as such acclaim, he wrote to somebody, I don't remember to whom, and he said, I got it right. And so, I wanted to represent it as best I could. And something really interesting, that as Cindy and I, because we did all the journeys together, and she's a great one to tell me that's not good, or that's not good enough, or I don't think that's right. And that's very helpful. But as we took all these journeys, people would tell us, and they'd say, I haven't told anybody this, and then they would tell me, and I felt like a father confessor, listening to Led Zeppelin. Yes, my son. Yes, my daughter. But they tell you these stories, and a lot of those names are people who told me stories, or people who told me about grandpa. And I would jot down the names so that grandpa could reappear, though he's long gone, getting a donut and a little affection. So yeah, I enjoyed those action things. I'm a dude, but I didn't want them to be the point of the book. I wanted it to be a true friendship. And again, the ghost of Le Guin. I don't know if I can even say this. It sounds a little racy, but it's, to me, the most hilarious piece of writing advice I ever got. And this was the entire book for me. Every time I wrote about those two, um, Ursula would get worked up sometimes and just let rip, And one day, out of the blue, we're hanging out, and she said, Luisito, I need to tell you something about male writing. And I said, okay, what do I need to know? And she said, invariably, when a man writes a book about a woman, she catches sight of herself in a mirror, and she says, my God, my breasts are magnificent. And then she hit the table and said, we don't do that. I was like, okay, I'll never do that. But it struck me as so vivid and wise what she was saying. And that is, don't see us through the male gaze, because you guys don't know what you're looking at. And you had mentioned to me earlier about crying. I cannot believe the audiences that are coming, which is, good for the ego, but all the women who are coming. And as soon as I start talking, people start to cry. And I'm not sure what I'm saying, except that I think, you're just, I think, telling your readers, I see you. You're the heroes of the story. You are the heroes. And I always admonish, because it's mixed ages, and I always tell the young people, you take your mom for granted. You take your granny for granted. You take your auntie for granted, and you shouldn't. You shouldn't. There is no, oh, it's just mom. That doesn't exist. Your mother is a hero. Just stop to think about what she's been through in life. And my example, which I think is true, is that repetitive thing the old timers will tell you. They keep telling you this little story, or this little remembrance, or this little anecdote that you should know, and you start tuning them out, because damn it, you're watching some good detective show on TV or whatever, and then they're gone. And one day when you get old enough, you're going to think, oh my God, what was that she kept telling me? What was that? And you've squandered your own legacy. You've let it slip away. You let her die. You could have kept her alive. So, all those things my mother said, Some of them kind of wacky, but all of them stuck with me. And I did not want her to die. She died alone, man. She died alone, no doubt having one of those nightmares. And because it was my mother, she was very much like Irene. This gesture was very Irene and my mother. They found her, and she had the King James Bible in bed with her, but also Julia Child's French cookbook. That's an Irene exit, if you ask me.
Yes, ma'am.
So, I just wanted to write a real story that had real human depth. And again, and it's not just in honor of my mother, but of her partner Jill, who is Dorothy in the novel. Jill was the most astonishing person you'll ever meet. It's too late now; she's gone. But
I wanted to ask about that, but first I wanted to say that there are two sort of archetypes I think most women readers will recognize in this book. And one is exactly that. I had a mom who was very provocative, who was kind of like Aurora Greenway from Terms of Endearment, except with
oh,
and if your mom died with Julia Child in bed, my mom died holding a martini in one hand and a cigarette in the other hand, and her gesture was this, and don't be boring, And so you write about your mom doing her
oh
cocktail
my
party
God,
in the sky with her clubmobile people and imagining herself as a bon vivant. My mom is sitting next to her trying to push her off the bench with her hip, and they're
good
both
Lord,
having a grand old time, right? But I think
dude!
anybody who has a mom will recognize the mom in this book, and the homage that you're paying, and also like best female friendship. Because when I was reading this, of course, I was imagining my best female friend and being in a donut truck with her for a year under unspeakable conditions, and how you would come to love that person. And also, there's a moment in here where you say they were such great friends that they could hate each other and be
Yeah.
angry with each other and like really just despise each other sometimes, and you have to be a really good friend to be able to do that. Can you talk about your mom and Jill a little bit?
Oh yeah. My mother. Oh, and by the way, I know you and I are related because my mother's gestures, she'd take a puff if you said something funny and she'd say, "Oh, darling." And then she'd but yeah, I here's the thing. When my mother had a cataclysmic crash at the end of the war and was almost killed, her legs were almost severed. She was torn apart, and she spent weeks and weeks in a MASH hospital. Um,
Which
but
is
she
in
said,
the book.
yeah, there's a version of that in the book. Yeah. So, but she used to say cryptically, "We never found the other girl." So all I knew was that she wasn't alone, and this thing went off a cliff in the Alps and exploded, and we never found her. And I thought that was Darling Jill. She always talked about Darling Jill, and she didn't talk much about Darling Jill. I would sometimes pin her down and ask questions, about the war, and she would tell me stuff, wonderful stuff. She had a lot to say about Georgie Patton, but um, but Jill, Jill, and in her photographs, there's Jill. She's a. I can show you in the end papers, readers who don't have it, but this is my favorite picture of them. They put pictures of me mom and her team. Is that? Oh, let me go.
It is good if you can squash it even more right up to the camera. But guys, you should obviously buy your copy right now. So there is Irene in her cap and her Red Cross uniform. That's
And
Lisa,
then,
and then the three women are Irene or Phyllis rather,
yeah, and
and
Jill.
Jill, who's Dorothy in the book, and Helen, who would be which one? Holly, maybe? Or there's always a third girl in the truck who sort of disappears. She can't
Well,
handle the heat in the kitchen of the clubmobile, basically.
well, you know this, being a master writer your own self, that too much division of focus, I think, kind of can betray the point. And it became to me a metaphor for their friendship. Oh, I kicked the camera, sorry. It became to me a metaphor of their friendship, that they were so intertwined that that poor third woman could just never get into it. I was that way with my best friend, um, a dude, but other people kind of were satellites around that intense binary star. And I thought that kind of tells the story for me, but it also keeps, I think, reiterating this theme that was not for everybody. It wasn't just a walk in the park like the Greatest Generation gang might have you think. So, Jill, long gone. And we had all these pictures of her. We have a picture of her popping out of the top of an army tank. You know what I'm referring to in the book. And we realized my mom's in the tank with her. My mom's looking out. They were just wild. They used to call them Mutt and Jeff back in the army days, which nobody knows now. Cartoon of two forlorn buddies out doing stuff. So, darling Jill, my mom died, in 1990, and I had all of her stuff, all of her notebooks, all of her journals, which I couldn't read, much too painful. Her notes she took about experiences during the war that were shot, and pictures. And I saw these portraits of her in a way, what she was really like, the woman you meet as Irene. For example, there's a certificate from Harry S. Truman. I said to Cindy, dude, we've got an autograph of Harry S. Truman. That's amazing. And I turned it over, and she had covered the back in little sketches and drawings of birdies and people. I thought, Mom. So we're researching together, newspaper woman, much more organized in her thoughts than I am. And we were going through all this stuff. And she found a piece in my mom's belongings written by Jill, typed from the early 50s, a fresh memoir about it. And there was an address label on the back. And we thought, this is remarkable because we live in Illinois, right? We live in Naperville, west of Chicago. And she lived in Champaign-Urbana, 90 minutes from our door. And we thought, how unlikely is this? So Cindy, I think, thought, correct me if I'm wrong, darling, but I think it was, let's send a letter to them and maybe somebody will, whatever. But we found out also, to our great shock, that there was a news interview with her and she was alive. So as soon as she got the letter, she called us. And she was 94 years old. And I've been telling everybody this because I loved it about her. She wasn't going to mess around with Luis. She called me Louis. And she got on the phone and she said, Louis, you must come see me. I said, we're coming this week. And she said, I'm 94 years old. Don't try to wait till I turn 95 if you catch my drift. And I thought, oh my God, I think I got a crush right now. And we drove down there and she was just amazing. But here's the deal. What I get sidetracked. There's so much to talk about, but we got to her place. She let us in, and on the wall, a framed portrait of my mom. And my mom's doing her pose, and I was just dumbstruck staring at it. And Jill comes up to me, and she gave me the book. She said, I drove the truck, but your mother brought the joy. And in that second, all that tormented, isolated, hating the fact she was getting old, lonely, woman you couldn't comfort because you didn't understand was gone. And here was this 27-year-old beauty with all of her, to Jill, very mysterious New York ways, doing her magic on everybody. That's where the book came from.
It's an amazing story. So you rediscovered your mom's clubmobile partner after she was gone. So as somebody who also has lost a mom, I think sometimes we get these messages from beyond like this. Like once in a while, like somebody will send me a book that was my mom's and it has her handwriting in it. Or I was selling a house recently and I took a painting down off the wall, and behind the painting, taped to it, were 3 Post-it notes that I had written to my mom saying, like, I'm leaving now. Have a great month. I love you. I'll see you soon. I'm like, who puts that on the back of a painting? Like, they're so weird, but like these messages from beyond, and you got them in the form of this incredible gift of a live woman who could give you keys to a past you never knew about. So my question about this, there are 2 questions to this. One is, what is one thing you learned about your mom from Jill that you didn't know? And the other question is actually more of a request, which is, can you please tell us about your mom's doorknob? So let's start there, because it's so magical to me. It's so magical. Tell us about the doorknob.
Oh, good Lord. Well, the thing about my mother that I didn't know came from Jill. I've told this story on the road because I'm just still astonished by it. But she had everything. She had the map she used to drive the truck, all that. And we spent years with her, visiting her regularly. So she had a private photo album, and it was black with black pages. And she opened it for me and said, "Here, look at this is my secret archive." And she had written in white under. So I'm looking through it, and there's my mom at Cannes on the beach, looking gorgeous as ever. I said, "There's my mom." She said, "Oh, Phil, yeah, she loved it there. Yeah." And then I turned the page, and there's a dude with my mom, and he's all wrapped her up in his arms. And he's got that look, the cat ate a canary look that some friggin' playboy gets on his face. He's like, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, what's this?" And she came over and she looked at it, and then she started to smile, and she said, "Oh, that's Jake." And I said, "Jake? Who's Jake?" And she said, "Lewis, it was the war." I was like, "Oh my God, don't say anything else." She said, "We all had men." I thought, no, no, I know, call the therapist. But then I thought, wait a minute, this is a young woman in the middle of hell, which is also the best time of her life, and it's all getting more and more on fire. Thank God she had a lover. Thank God sometime in her life somebody actually adored her. That was one thing I did not know and didn't expect. Um, the doorknob. So this is also related to that stinking jig. Okay. So um, messages from beyond all the time working on this book. Jill died. The university put together, a special archive for the library for her because she was attached to the university. So we went down there and they gave us a whole day with all of her papers, a last chance to see it. And they just left us, went and did other stuff. I kicked it again. Went and did other stuff. And in her stuff, there were letters from soldiers. And there's a guy writing to Jill saying, "Oh, you gals, we're so wonderful. And I've never forgotten you all these years, how kind you were to give us all this coffee and so forth." And then he says, "How about that Phil? How about that Phil? Is she still obsessed with that hot shot fighter pilot, Jake?" And I thought, oh my God, he was Top Gun to my mom. What? I never knew Jake was some hot pilot. Hence, in some ways, handyman. Um, so after my mother died, she died alone in our house in San Diego. I was living in Boston. I had to leave Boston and get back to my house. Everything we had was just sitting there. Nobody, no relatives, nobody to look out for it. And when I was cleaning things up, and it was an old house from the 40s, and the doorknobs weren't antique like they are in the novel, but they were hollow, and they were brass, and they had a little perfectly round shield or plug that apparently was held in by flanges inside. And hers had popped out. And I went to pick it up, and I looked into the doorknob, and there was a guy with black hair staring out. And I peeled it out of there, and she had cut around another picture. You could maybe see somebody's part of their shoulder, but she had cut this guy out and stuck him in there. And I realized that man protected her at night from the Nazis, from her nightmares. That was the man. I never knew who he was. Though after seeing Jake a couple of times, he had dark hair. He was kind of dashing, had a little Gary Cooper vibe about him. I think it was the handyman protecting her. So that's how I don't want to give away too much about the ending of the book, but that I think that's some of her iconography after the war in the novel, you know, was
That is
the whispers of
amazing.
my mom.
That is amazing. I wonder, I mean, because you did find Jill, I wonder if now that this book is out in the world, if Jake is still alive, he would be like 106, but he might still be alive and be very dashing and show up on a rascal to one of your readings. You never know. Like, Jake, if you're out there, we're on to you, buddy. We're on to you. But a very moving part of the book, I felt that Irene has a love affair with a man she calls Handyman, and his name is Hans. And so, but they all call him the Handyman because, as she says, like, you must be good with your hands. Like, there's a lot of sauce in this book, and
Yeah.
so, you know, I thought it was a very beautiful and incredibly poignantly sad oasis in the novel that she could have this love affair at a time when everything was literally on fire around them and crumbling in the strangest and most unexpected and most grotesque ways. Again, that you don't shy away from. I want to read something. We have so many audience questions, but I have like a couple more questions for you. Two more. Well, I have like 50, but I'll ask two. One is
Okay.
about this. I read something that I loved from the book so much, which are the letters that these women got when they were en route in the clubmobile. They would get letters from the GIs whom they had served donuts, which they called sinkers, and coffee to. And again, it sounds like a sort of a soft job to just be in this big truck handing out coffee and donuts. But what quickly became apparent to these women is that they were the last familiar faces and voices from home that many of these men would see before they died, before they went off into combat and died like that day. And so sometimes they would get mail, which is also astonishing to me. Like, how do you even get mail in a country that is, or a theater that's being torn apart? But they would get mail from some of the men who survived and find out what happened to them. So here's one of the notes, and it's so representative. I feel like this book is like the war written by Larry McMurtry in a lot of ways, because it's also very funny. And the banter and the repartee is very funny. And so this is sort of an example of like what you hear from the guys and the girls. Quick note to say thanks. I never been scared and lonesome like I've been over here. I always counted on you angels, though, to pull me out of it. And I don't have no good words, but I had to let you know I'd marry any one of you. Just write me back and I'm your daddy. A gentleman from hell, Smiley. And has like notes like peppered throughout like the letters, but not only the really dear ones from Handyman / Jake, but also these notes from the GIs. Were these actual notes? Did you find some of these in your mom's papers and Jill's papers that they received from the GIs?
Yeah. Yeah. Again, my mom I don't know why she didn't keep any of those letters. She had issues, I think, with, romantic males after what she'd lived through. Her life with my dad was not a picnic either. So she'd had 2 strikeouts. And I think the man that she loved, who knows what that outcome was, because nobody knows. But yeah, Jill did. She kept them. Jill had a very healthy ego, and she kept the stuff where people praised them. And it meant a lot to her. And sometimes the letters, it would just have a line that was too good to not use, and then a letter would bloom around it. But yeah, they were fantastic letters, like that guy saying, "How about that, Jake?" The hot shot. And that was something that hadn't occurred to me, though. And the thing is, I think I mentioned this to you earlier, but the Red Cross Records building burned down. So they have been erased, quite literally. All their names are gone, and that's tragic. And but some of the women who were there hooked up with each other and kept in touch. And there's a book nobody knows about. No one can find it. Printed by a woman who we think was in a retirement home, and she started a press for that one book, and it's called the American Red Cross Clubmobile Ark in the Storm. And it's part of the epigraph at the beginning of the book, a quote from that book. But in that book, there's all kinds of pictures of my mom. There's a picture of my mom delivering mail in a combat zone, a city, I think. Oh, look, Cindy just retrieved the book. My darling, look what my partner did. If you can find this, Get it, because nobody can find it if you're at all interested in this. But there are pictures of all the women. They have pictures in here of the actual trucks, people's uh, location, where they were, what they did. I'm thumbing through. There are pictures of my mother, like I said, delivering mail. And in this book is my mother's own telling of how she spent Christmas Eve in Bastogne, which I did not know. So I found it there. And let me tell you how cool this is about what we're talking about, the research. So on tour already, zillions of people coming, which is so cool. But a woman, I was in Seattle, and a woman came forth and had a picture of her mom standing in front of a truck. And I said, "Oh, that's a clubmobile." Yeah, yeah, right? Red Cross. I said, "Yeah, Red Cross. Which truck was it?" She said, "I don't know." Well, what group was she at? I don't know, because mom didn't talk. So we got her mom's name. We got into the book and looked at all the stuff and all the notes and so forth, found out the name of her mom's truck, found out what group she was in. My mom was in group F, so I put Irene in that group. There were 120 women with all those trucks driving around. And what we found out, which this woman had no idea, was that not only was her mom with my mom, but she and her truck were the first truck to drive through the Arc de Triomphe when Paris was liberated.
Shut up.
I know, it's insane. Life is a crazy novel. And to think that you can do that, a chance meeting at a reading, someone who just wanted to connect with her mom's history, and we were able to find that for her, is just, it's better than bestseller status or any award, that you can actually reach through the decades of wondering and say, look what your mom did.
Yeah.
How cool is that, man? It's amazing.
Yes, this book is a great public service in that way, and among other ways. I think one of the great things that books do for us is they form that connective webbing, and like among us and among our disparate human experiences. But like what it also sometimes does, and what this book does, is form a webbing between now and history. And I think those of us who had moms who were secretive, or who had parents who were secretive because of their experiences, like you're giving people keys with this book to get into that history, as you received those keys from the doorknob, and from Jill. And your research is so amazing. So I have so many more questions. We do have audience questions. I want to ask, I'm trying to decide between my top two remaining questions. I guess one is, as I said, you don't shy away from depicting things that are really difficult about war, that are grotesque, that are startling, that are atrocious. And I think that's so important. Like, I think novelists writing about war do not aspire to pull your punches because you're being unfair to experience. You're not getting it right. And Stephen Crane would lambaste you from beyond the grave for that. It's a grave mistake. You go into Buchenwald here. You have a village that is completely destroyed by German panzers. Is there a scene, we've talked about nightmares a little bit in this interview as well, was there a scene that gave you nightmares to write that you are haunted by? Or if not, conversely, like, is there a scene that you did have nightmares about that you wrote out of your system into the book?
That's very interesting. I think when I've never talked about this, so thanks for outing me to the public. But when these things started surfacing in my mother, I was pretty young. And I realize now I had a terrifying nightmare. And now I'm understanding the symbology of the nightmare, because it was repetitive and it was the same exact thing whenever it came. And that was, my mother was talking to me because she would read me to sleep. And suddenly her voice would start to echo, and she'd get farther and farther and farther away, and I couldn't hear her anymore. And then the world began to shrink, and I was trapped, yelling, trying to get somebody to see me. And I remember the worst part, but it woke me up every time I had this dream. Mom was gone. And I could hear her telling me, dear boy, don't be ridiculous. Don't be silly. Mama's right here. And I would open my eyes and look up, and these huge ants with human faces were coming down the wall to get me. Bah! So that was the dream that I've never had again. Not for ages, but I think that was related to feeling my mother disappear. I didn't know what was going on. The physicality stuff, the Buchenwald stuff happened because I opened my mom's footlocker, her army footlocker, and found her Buchenwald pictures, 4th grade. She told me not to. And you know what it's like being a kid. You know there's something interesting in there. I opened it up, and there were the pictures of the shot, murdered, starved, naked men on the ground. And she knew I'd gone into the trunk. She knew right away that I'd gone in it. And we had to sit down. It was the first time we really discussed the war. She said, "Did you see the pictures?" And I said, "Yeah." And so she came clean, and she said, "I didn't know. I wasn't ready for it. I didn't know what I was getting into." And when I found those people, they were everywhere. She said, "I had my camera, so I took pictures because I felt somebody should have a record of it. And then I was ashamed of myself for exploiting what I was looking at. And I stopped taking pictures. But ever since then, I have been ashamed of myself that I stopped taking pictures. I should have taken the entire roll there." And so, those were two things that were nightmarish for sure. But, mom would come close and then pull away, and come close and then pull away and keep things secret. Though if she met a veteran, that was different. And it was never with me. She'd go to talk to them about stuff.
Thank you for talking about your dream. It reminds me, there's a scene in the book where the ladies are trapped in a basement that then floods, and there are all these rats, and the rats come flooding out of the destroyed sewers and into the basement where they are, and it's just this horrific and beautiful, like exquisitely grotesque, like beautifully rendered lived experience feeling thing. And all of this book reads like lived experience to me, not like research, which is one of the extraordinary things about it. But I'm struck, Luis, that what you're describing, I used to interview survivors for Survivors of the Shoah Foundation, the Holocaust survivors, and also liberators.
Oh.
And your dream is very
wow.
second gen, as we would say. It's very 2-gen, like the second generation who knows that the parent is keeping something locked up because of trauma. Like, there's a shape of something in your parent and it's very tangible, but you don't find out what it is almost ever. And they will never tell you, but they will tell other people, right? So this is it's a universal experience among the second generation. And it's so important that you speak to that and write about it. I'd like to take a couple of audience questions. We've kept you a really long time, so we'll do lightning round. Audience Q, you said you have spent your career practicing and preparing to write this book. How did you know it was time? And generally, how does a writer know if it's the right time for a project? Great question.
Gosh, I think that is a great question. I think it's like when a butterfly has to lay those eggs in your garden. It just happens. It's time. It's time. I didn't know it was time because I didn't know it was a story. I didn't, it had been so compartmentalized and sort of pushed aside. And, mother didn't want to see herself as somebody who was a grizzled war veteran in any way. And she still thought she was a blithe spirit, though she was anything but. My partner. She's truly my partner in all crime. We take every book tour together, every trip, 500 second honeymoons, if you know what I'm saying. And we were talking, I believe, in bed about this. And she said, "Well, tell me more about your mom." And I said, "She was a donut dolly." "What's that?" I said, "You know the donut dollies?" "No, really? What was that?" So I said, "The women in the Red Cross who went into World War II and liberated Buchenwald, and they drove a 2.5-ton truck with a donut maker, and they'd make donuts under." Cindy said, "What?" Damascus Road, the light shone on me, and I thought, if you don't know, because you're actually your entire career is being informed. All the women out there don't know this. And it started percolating, and I thought, wow. And then when we found Jill, I knew I had to, and I was trying to finish it before she died, but she died first.
And she lived to be 104 PS people. So she
102, 102.
102. Okay, well, I'm a fiction writer. I just make this.
Yeah, no, she would have taken the extra 2 years for sure.
Yeah, I'm sure she would still be alive now. Like to be like, excuse me, I'm doing the interview. Like that was her persona. Okay, another audience question, please. Great anecdote about Le Guin and male writing. LOL. What were one or two other things that Ursula Le Guin taught you about writing that you still remember?
Oh my goodness, there's so much about her. She if you go to my website, it's luisurrea.com. There's an essay about her. It's called Toll Fink Was Here. Toll Fink was her nickname, and she got it from visiting a druid cave in Great Britain, and there were runes carved in the stone, and the tour guide told them this must have taken months and months to chisel this out in the stone in here. And Ursula, expecting some illumination, she said, well, do you know what it says? And he said, oh yes, I do. And she said, what does it say? And he says, why, it says Tollfink was here. It's like it was graffiti. And her sense of humor was such that she just hung on to that her whole life. So if you wanted to reach her in a crowd, have somebody pass her a note, hello, Tollfink. And she knew it was somebody close to her, because not everybody knew. And we had this wonderful thing all those years. And near the end of her life, I was able to present her with a Lifetime Achievement Award, which was so great. But we'd see each other and we'd do events together. And that story is a whole other interview. But my father was killed in Mexico by Mexican cops, and they made me buy his body. Rough. And I was 21, 22, and I didn't know how to deal with it. So I wrote a story, and when she came to UCSD, my professor gave it to her, and she said, I'd like to meet this young man. And I'd never met anybody famous. I was reading Ursula at the time. I was a sci-fi fiend, and I had to go to her apartment, and I knocked on the door, and this little tiny woman with a page boy haircut, glass of whiskey, and a pipe, like a dude's briar wood, whatever they're called, pipe. And I already thought, wow, this is so awesome. And she said, Luisito, come in. And I went in there and I sat down, and she said, tell me about your father. So I told her about my dad. And then she said, tell me about yourself. I told her about me, what I knew. And she said, well, I just wanted you to know I really like the story, and I'd like to buy it. And I was so stupid. She had the mimeograph. That's dating me, isn't it? The mimeograph of it. And I said, you don't need to buy it. You've already got a copy. She said, no. I'm editing an anthology. I'm asking to publish you. So it was my first publication.
Oh my God, amazing story. Thank you for sharing her with us as well. You're bringing us all the women we want to know more about. Okay, we have one more question, then we have to let you go because you got hit the road. From Ellen, our wonderful Twitter director, did your mother live to see your literary success?
No, she did not. And this might, two things. This is going to sound unbelievably pretentious, but I did get a job at Harvard teaching expository writing, which that was my mom's greatest Yahoo of her life, if you can imagine such a thing. I'd never been anywhere, and I went there. But just to let you know, she was a believer in what I was trying to do. And we were in some dire straits when I left. And Christmas time, she couldn't really afford much of a gift for me. And my mom gave me a little, about this long, beautifully wrapped antique paper, flat little gift. And I opened it, and it was postage stamps so that I could submit one more poem or story somewhere. And we have a wonderful picture of the two of us just laughing like crazy. She liked to call herself poor old Ma. I think we were having sherry, just laughing our heads off. But then, I got to I got to go to Boston and make a little money and fly her to Boston. And I reunited her with her family that she'd abandoned it in 1947. So that was good stuff, man. It worked out.
That is an amazing story as well. Thank you. And you, I think, I don't know if you feel this way, but I feel that you have resurrected her so much in this book that I think there could be no greater act of love than trying to imagine the world through a parent's eyes when they're young and really feel that as an independent person, not the person responsible for you and your care and feeding as a child and then as a grown child, but as a person in their own right. It is such an act of love and honor. What do you think poor old Ma would say about this book? What would her review be about Goodnight Irene?
Oh gosh, I think she'd be happy. I don't know how she'd feel about the love scenes. Hey, but that's Irene, not you, Mom. I had to have a little distance, because I always tell people if you wrote those scenes about your actual mom, you might have to have some therapy. But and the little joke which she would appreciate is Phil and Jill make cameos all through the book. They drive by in their own truck, just to establish that these people I'm writing are fictional characters. And Cindy and I have talked about this a bunch of times that Jill is driving Phil around the universe in some incredible Flibberty Gibbet space jeep. And the things that are happening around the book are just so strange to me and wonderful to me that I like to think that they're celebrating. They're saying, thumbs up, kid. Not that I'm a kid now. Thumbs up, Grandpa. I feel them. I feel them, which sounds hokey, but I really do.
I believe in that 1000%, my friend. Thank you. And I think anybody who reads this book will feel them too. Now I'm all getting all choked up. I promised myself I would make it through this interview without getting teary, but I do think anybody who reads this book will be able to feel the spirit of your mom and of Jill. So thank you for sharing them with us. Thank you for being here while you are on tour and stopping by in your own clubmobile. Cindy, would you like to pop on and just say hello? The partner in crime, or just your hand?
Hello.
Thank you to both of you bringing us this incredible true story. Everybody, please go buy at least 50 copies right now. Irene, you should. You will be so happy you did. It is a phenomenal, it is a magnificent, it is a masterful work. So thank you. Thanks, you guys. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a wonderful Friday, wonderful weekend. Lots of reading.